I have to admit, I'm actually quite excited about reviewing this particular item. Following previous videos, this is a Class D, and whilst I'm not expecting it to meet its specifications, because like all these Chinese boards, there's a slight exaggeration in some of the parameters. But I've had this particular board on test in the listening room for probably 2 weeks now, and instantly I liked it. I know you don't hear that from me very often, but this board is not perfect and there are some issues with it, but using these things, I think I've told you before that of late I've started to listen to the product before it goes anywhere near the bench. Apart from initial power up, I always power it up on the bench with a current restricted power supply, simply because I don't really want to burn my house down, and well, we won't go in that direction. But let's look at the positive side, because there are a lot of positives on this particular amplifier. Right, I have the amplifier connected and we will throw the power on, and you may hear just a faint sound of the fans because they're very quiet. 45 volts and 180 milliamps. Now that might initially sound a lot, but when you consider there is actually 4 separate amplifiers on this board, 2 per channel, and we're also running the fans from that as well. So that corresponds to about 72 milliamps per stereo or per mono amplifier, including the fans, and I suspect the fans are using probably about a quarter of that. So I don't think there's any issue with the current consumption, and it's the whole thing, including the 2 fans, is consuming 8 watts at this 45 volts. I've had this running off camera for about half an hour and nothing is running hot on the amplifier. Now bearing in mind there's no signal on it, but in previous models the usual regulator chips run red hot. But so far I have to report it runs very cool, and I've actually run it earlier with the fans disconnected and nothing gets more than just fingertip warm. So far, very optimistic. Let's do our first power test. We've got 1 kilohertz into 8 ohms, and we'll drive it until just about clipping. Which is about there, and we have 25, 26, 27, 28.5 volts, which according to my mathematics and the meter is 101.5 watts. So quite a long way off its specification, but a very respectable power. So shall we have a go at 4 ohms, or do you think we're tempting Providence there? Right, we're going to have a go at 4 ohms now. Now, the danger in this case is that my load box will catch fire rather than necessarily my amplifier. So we will have to make a very quick test on this, because the load box is already almost too hot to touch with that 100 watts going into it. Because although I was only filming for you over a short period, it all had to be set up and checked over before I did it. So the amplifier's been running on pure 100 watts for the last 5 minutes. So the load box is suffering a little bit at the moment. So here we go. The power supply may go into current limiting, I don't know. I can hear it. Oh, we've gone into current limiting. Let's turn that back a bit. It's still going into current limiting. I think we may run out of current. That's the maximum here, which is 27 volts. Now that's the maximum I can test on this power supply because it's a 5 amp power supply. And if we look over here, if I can get the scope into it as well, when I turn this up, watch the current here. This power supply is rated at 5 amps. So we've taken all the current limiting off and let's drive it. Yeah, we're into current limiting there, and you can see the square wave. Now that's not the amplifier clipping, it's me running out of power. So that is actually 25, 26, 27 volts, and I can feel the heat coming off this load. Well, my friends, I'm absolutely lost for words. Using 4 ohm load, we're getting 175.5 watts. And that's not the amplifier limiting, that's my power supply limiting at 5 amps. Now I do have another power supply that was rated at 10 amps, which I might test using that later. The only thing that worries me about it is that one hasn't got current limiting on. So if anything goes nasty, much smoke and fire. But anyway, within the limits of what I can test at the moment, that is very impressive, I have to say. These fans do a very impressive job. They are, well, bearing in mind one's been driven and the other one hasn't, and I can't tell the difference. Both feel cold. The inductors are cold. There's just the, I think this is the channel, yes it is the channel we're using. The inductors have just the faintest hint that they're slightly above ambient temperature. And all the other chips, that's obviously the preamp, which if that gets hot we're in dead trouble. And the other various inductors, bearing in mind they're not directly cooled by this, but they do receive some air. Stone cold. Yep, stone cold. So I think the conclusion is these must be genuine Texas Instrument chips. We know that they're not going to meet the published spec, quite simply because they rate it anyway at 10% THD, and that's not, to me, that's not real power, that's just a distorted square wave. So within the realms, because I think you must admit that my testing is fairly strict as regards power, but I don't know why people should test them any other way, because if the signal's distorted, it means it's unusable at those powers. So to say it's got 600 watts, why would you say that? It's completely superfluous. This is the square wave at 1 kilohertz. Now the mush on the top here is the part of the switching frequency, and I don't have the necessary filters to be able to show you that terribly well, but we will take it up. Yes, I can't make a terribly good display on this, simply because I can't filter out the carrier frequency, but that's 10 kilohertz. Out of curiosity, this is our switching frequency and is not sound, so don't think that is the sine wave. Well, it is a sort of sine wave, but it's the switching frequency, and it's at 500, well, as near as damn it's 600 kilohertz, so slightly above your hearing. Normally it would look like that, but opening it up on the scope, that's what we see. Shall we have some conclusions? Good idea, Mike. Right, I've done some frequency response curves off screen because, as I've said before, it's a bit boring seeing a line going across the scope for such a long time. But these are the figures and conclusions. As probably most of you know, the actual high frequency response of the amplifier will depend on the chokes and the capacitors on the output. Along with any filter, they only are accurate at one frequency. Now that's a bit sad when you think that you're putting in anything from a few hertz up to 20 kilohertz. Now the filters by and large don't affect the low end, so you can virtually ignore that. But they do have an impact on the high end of the amplifier. The conclusion is that it's more suitable for an 8 ohm speaker than a 4 ohm speaker. But saying that, it's not terrible. But by current transistor or op-amp frequency response, the HF response is, I wouldn't say poor, because there are many amplifiers, i.e. the quad and the name, that have a similar response. Let me put you out of your misery. With an 8 ohm load, it's 1 dB down, so not nasty, 1 dB down at 22 kilohertz. And the low end is 1 dB down at 5 hertz. So not tacky, pretty good, pretty good. But at 4 ohms, it's less than impressive, shall we say. But again, dare I say, this is 1 dB down. So it's not, it's minuscule, but just by today's standards, you'd expect it to be flat, and it's not. It's 1 dB down at 13 kilohertz, and it's 2 dB down at 20 kilohertz. So clearly, the output filters are not designed optimally for 4 ohms. Now, I would have expected them to be designed more for, let's say, 6 ohms. I know you're going to say they don't have 6 ohm speakers, but that means there would be a slight lift at 20 kilohertz into 8 ohms and a very slight cut into 4 ohms. That would be the best compromise, but clearly this is made optimally for 8 ohm speakers. But don't think if you're going to listen to it on a 4 ohm speaker it's going to sound dreadful, because it doesn't. My loudspeakers in the lounge are monitor audios, and they have a nominal 8 ohm load impedance. But when I've measured it at certain frequencies, it does drop to 3.8 ohms. But it sounds really good. I cannot fault the sound of it. And it's probably, well, no, it is the best Class D amplifier I've heard. And it has so much power. I know it doesn't meet its spec, but you didn't honestly think it was going to, did you? I mean, fantasy watts, 10%. For a genuine 100 watts into 8 ohms, and what did I do? I gave up, I think, after, I forgot what the numbers were now, but a lot of power into 4 ohms. So it's not a PA amplifier. I mean, it's not. It truly is a high quality sound. And whilst I haven't as yet done any direct comparisons, i.e. with the old switch, listening to it for now 2 weeks, most every day, I must admit I find it a very likeable sound, and it's silent. There's no hum on it and there's no hiss on it. So the conclusion I have is the components on it must be genuine. Now, bearing in mind this amplifier is not cheap, not like if you watched the last video I put out using the, oh, I haven't got it here at the moment, using that cheap amplifier, which I'm convinced is just so full of fake components, it's unreal. Nothing gets hot on this. I've actually been operating it without the fans. I've removed the fans. When I say remove them, I've removed the supply to them. And under music conditions, really loud, the heat sinks provided on there are so much better than these things. These heat sinks, which are commonly fitted to these Class Ds, they've got a lot of mass to them and they take quite a while to heat up, but they've got relatively small amounts of metal in contact with air, and they don't cool the device well at all. The fans on here are the kind that they use in computers to cool the main processor, and are very efficient even with the fans off. Under normal music conditions into 8 ohms, maybe different into 4, it's debatable that you even need the fans running at all. And in fact, later on today, I'm going to experiment with putting the fans in series so they will run at roughly half speed. They're not noisy. In fact, if I turn, the camera is now about a foot away from the fans. If I turn the power on now, I don't know how well that's coming up, but my head is right by the camera and I can hear the fans. Bear in mind they're running at full power. They're not, sadly, thermostatically controlled. But I shall come back with another video and I'll tell you what the results are for different types of cooling. But if you're going to use this domestically, even at high levels, it's actually debatable whether you need the fans on at all, because these actual heat sinks, look at the amount of area that's in contact with the air. It's 100 times more than those metal ones. About these capacitors, they're 470 microfarad each, but only 50 volts. So although this is rated at 48 volts, don't do it, because that is very near the limits of those capacitors and you don't want them blowing up. I suppose you could always change them if you felt that way inclined, but there's not a lot of space. Height wise you could go, but width wise you couldn't. I don't know, it's something I might look at, but saying that, you've seen the results running at 45 volts, and any amplifier, you never want to go to the absolute maximum. Everything runs cool, and even without the fans running, all these chips on here don't get hot. So I think that this board, I'm fairly confident in suggesting that they're using a proper Texas Instrument chip, because otherwise you wouldn't get that sort of power. And the main thing in its favour is the cooling. These chips really do need cooling. Check the suppliers carefully. I think the rule with these things is the basic chip from Texas Instrument is very good. Can't fault it. But the very cheap boards, I'm convinced, are fakes. Everything else on the boards are fake. But this one, I'm fairly optimistic because nothing gets over hot and it all seems to work. And the noise is just, you can put your ear right to the speaker and there's no hum, no hiss, just perfect, and doesn't sound bad either. If you're going to run into 8 ohms, a 45 volt 5 amp power supply on music will be fine, because why would you want to listen to sine waves? They're not good. Because you can see I can get full power into 8 ohms, but that's just one channel operating. But with music, you're using probably less than 20% of the current. So a 5 amp power supply will get you by. But if your speakers are approaching 4 ohms, or you're going to use it into 4 ohms for long periods, you will need a 10 amp power supply. 45 volts, 10 amps. No more than 45 volts. I've warned you. Don't blame me. I don't want to see on the comments that you tried 50 volts and the capacitors blew up, because they will. Don't do that. Thank you for watching as usual. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.